So he very graciously made sure he was here and made the time and so on. He was here all of yesterday. So he's going to have to present and leave. So Fredson, you have 15 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. As we said, my name is Fredson. So the title of my research is the Cyclone Idai. Well, I will probably change it later on. The political economy of the Mozambican state and the progressive social movement's response to unprecedented cyclonic climate shocks. So this research, broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, I must say, it's triggered by the need to investigate the paradox facing carbon democracies as the world is increasingly facing unprecedented effects of anthropogenic climate change, driven precisely by the process of carbon extraction. So the process of carbon extraction, which generates democratic practice, threatens at the same time the very existence of this same democratic practice and democratic nations, as it causes climate change and ecological disaster. And as a research questions, I tried to interrogate how the Mozambican state and the progressive social movement organizations respond to the effects of the climatic cyclonic shocks of Cyclone Idai. In terms of secondary questions, I look at how the domestic and international pressure for climate justice influence these responses. What are the climate crisis challenges facing Mozambique, and how are these crises perceived by the local and the central state, and as well by the progressive social movement organizations in the country. I also tried to look at what forms of social movements resistance to carbon development have emerged in Mozambique, and how the state is responding to these forms of resistance. So I use Michael Bureau's extended case method, and obviously I had to stay for quite a bit of time in the city of Beira in Mozambique, and also in Maputo. And the progressive social movement organization that I've selected is National Union of Small-Scale Farmers of Mozambique, and again, a member of La Via Campesina pushing for food sovereignty and agroecology as well. And ADECRU is a rural youth organization, and Justice Ambiental, which is the member of the Friends of the Earth International. Yeah, so these call them progressive because they are fighting for systemic change using basically the principle of agroecology and just transition. Why do I wish? Brewer says in his method, the process of arriving to a theory that one aims to reconstruct is a kamikaze process. You just select a theory that you feel like it's worth reconstructing, try to identify failures, and then you go. I selected metabolic rift, Max metabolic rift. Why did I do that? Well, despite enabling us to understand the conflict between capitalism and nature and offering a model of society that resolves this conflict, Marx's theory of metabolic rift fails to explain two important dynamics. So I'll be throwing myself here against the lions. First, it fails to explain how capitalist states respond to significant anthropogenic disruptions to the human nature metabolism. Secondly, it fails to explain how associated producers respond to shocks emerging from the consequence of anthropogenic disruptions to human nature metabolism. In summary, I argue that Marx fails to explain the agency of states and non-state actors in the context of the consequences of anthropogenic disruptions to human nature metabolism. Added to this, I feel like there is a need to locate Marx's metabolic rift theory in the current context of mounting global pressure for post-carbon society as a way to fix the metabolic rift. So that's the reason why I propose a reconstruction of Marx's theory, but by extension, because I agree with the fundamentals, like, for example, the disruption of the human nature relations. So this critique of Marx's ecological theory is not disconnected from neither the debates against Marx's ecological theory nor other debates that followed Marx's development of his theory, like Saito and Satgar, who have discussed some of these critiques. I also do not take Marx as a prophet in the sense that his texts should be applied literally and directly in today's context, neither as providing the answers for all the questions. This critique also understands the vast, unfinished, and contradictory nature of Marx's corpus, as said by Satgar. However, there should be no doubt that Marx's ecological theory provides significant methodological frameworks for investigating and understanding current ecological crisis as the central contradiction of the current historical system of social production and reproduction. Bond, Patrick, for example, sees the failure of Marx's theory of metabolic rift that addressed here, actually addressed by another Karl, who, contrary to Marx, lived and studied in a society where civil society actors already existed. Karl Polanyi. As part of his critique of market economy and liberalism, develops a concept of fictitious commodities, in which there is a deep alienation between humans and nature. Polanyi argues that labor, land, and money cannot be defined as commodities, simply because none of them is produced for sale on the market. Satgar and Williams find Polanyi's interpretation of human alienation from nature in a market economy is very similar to Marx's conception of the metabolic rift. In fact, while Marx used the terms rift, Polanyi used the terms alienation. However, both refer to human disconnection from nature. However, it is in Polanyi's thesis of double movement that we may find some insights that seem to address Marx's failure to discuss at least the agents of non-state actors when they are confronted with disruption to nature, disruption to human nature metabolism. Polanyi's double movement occurs due to efforts to disconnect economy from society. Two opposing movements constitute market societies: the laissez-faire movement to expand the scope of the market and the protective counter movement that emerges to resist the disembedding of the economy. Although the working class movement has been a key part of the protective counter movement. According to Polanyi, the counter movement occurs inevitably as a form of resistance to market economy. Scholars view the resistance movement to market economy in the rural areas, for example, as part of Polanyi's counter movement, and occurring more commonly than we generally understand, assume, or wish to admit their existence in many parts of the world. In this context, those who would see in Polanyi's thesis of counter-movement of resistance insights that address Marx's ecological failure, failure to incorporate the agents of organized producers, would conclude that when confronted with disruption to human nature metabolism, civil society actors inevitably show resistance. However, despite offering significant insight to understand the contradiction of market economy and liberalism, including conceptualizing nature as a commodity, contrary to Marx's theory of metabolic rift, Polanyi doesn't seem to theorize on market economy from an ecological perspective. That is, while Polanyi addresses where a market economy places the role of nature, including changes to this role throughout the history, he does not theorize on market disruption to nature, not even the way this process of disruption occurs, as Karl Marx did with the theory of metabolic rift. Marx looked at historical changes in soil fertility to arrive to the conclusions that allowed him to construct his metabolic rift theory. Polanyi's engagement with nature is not enough to constitute an ecological theory. Even Satgar and Williams, who have engaged with the work of Polanyi, have referred to him as having engaged with ecological issues, but not as having offered an ecological theory. Nature in Polanyi's work, as advanced by Satgar and Williams, commented a significant place in his macro-historical and political economy understanding of the perilous role of a self-regulated market society. It is important, however, to highlight that the prevailing lack of consensus in the field of ecology itself on what should or should not constitute a theory, including a general theory. Ecologists have been using the term theory to refer to many things, ranging from highly specific to very general hypotheses and conceptual frameworks. This lack of consensus might be behind some looking at conceptualizations of nature as theorizing in ecology. Moreover, a theory as advanced by Market et al. Is a hierarchical framework that contains clearly formulated postulates based on a minimal already set of assumptions and so on and so on and so on. So later on, I also addressed another Satgar's suggestion on how Marx should be read, proposing a reading of ecological Marx. And well, I also think that despite this reading of ecological Marx, as suggested by Satgar, despite providing relevant input to reading Marx's extensive corpus, it remains an interpretative extension of Marx's ecological theory, since they are not based on Marx's own postulates about workers and or social responses to the consequence of the metabolic rift. Thus, an extension of the analytical reach of metabolic rift theory still remains necessary, especially in the current context in which humanity is suffering the consequence of ecocide. So I will then refer to some of the preliminary findings. I was just trying to justify why do I think the metabolic rift needs to be reconstructed. In terms of findings, I found now a different number of responses, which I already have discussed in many occasions here, like the central government of Mozambique put in place responses which are labeled as political responses, legal and administrative responses, and humanitarian responses. Again, I'm talking about the type of responses to the effects of Cyclone Idai. So the municipality of Beira put in place a rapid management disaster responses, which means cleaning the city and so on, immediately when it was hit by the cyclone, reclaiming local political autonomy. This was in relation to local and the central government, designing a municipal recovery and resilience plan, appealing for global international solidarity, and more importantly, when I look at the responses by the progressive social movement organizations, yes, they did humanitarian support, but they also they put in place systemic solutions, right? Like, for example, using agroecology to fight disaster. So this was the first time I found agroecology as being used as to fight ecological disaster. So, solidarity as well, peasant-to-peasant solidarity, allocating land to other peasants, farmers that had lost their land, and things like using the consequences of Cyclone Idai to prove the existence of climate change. So to finish, I'm heading towards concluding that in times when confronted with climate shocks, states usually do respond use the mainstream response, like humanitarian way. However, progressive social movement organizations, they propose systemic response like agroecology, for example. But I am still digging into exactly what happened. Thank you very much.
So before I bring in Awande, I just want to say that Marx agrees with Fredson, because you see, the Marxist method is about the conditions that shape and generate production, reproduction, and ultimately socio-ecological orders. So your engagement with Marx is consistent with that. Really good. My appeal to everyone who considers themselves a Marxist is read Marx for our times. Very important. That's exactly what you're doing. And I do think what that means is that we've got to read Marx from the standpoint of colonial Marx, from the standpoint of the ecological Marx, and the radical democratic Marx. This is the Marx of our times. Okay? Great stuff.
Great. Ooh, can you hear me? Good. Okay. I just want to push you a little bit. So Marx's concept of the meta social relations between humans and nature and the ways in which that gets broken when we right? Is actually coming in at a different angle, and he talks about nature is not inherently a commodity, but capitalism commodifies it in the interest of profits. So Marx isn't talking about, in the metabolic rift, isn't talking about the commodification of nature necessarily. He's talking about this broken rift. And Polanyi, reading Polanyi with Marx actually helps you deepen the metabolic rift idea. It's not just that there's this break from this ontological idea I started talking about before, is deeply embedded in a Polanyi-esque notion of commodifying nature, which kind of definitively makes us humans versus nature, or humans and nature, rather than Marx's humans in nature. I think you should maybe try to do a little more in seeing how reading them together can actually deepen that both notions in a way, or how they speak to complementing each other and actually deepening our understanding of the metabolic rift.
A little bit about some of the fieldwork insights you to Idai.
Comrade, I have not come across that concept in my research or in my engagement with participants. So I'm not so sure about that debate either. I'm not sure whether this answers your question. Yeah, and one of the interesting things I found, especially with ADECRU, the Association of Rural Youth, is that immediately when the cyclone hit, they then started contacting other progressive social movement in the world, like the MST. And together with the MST and the Socialist Party of Zambia, they organized a delegation, and they call it a brigade. They organized a brigade made of doctors, Brazilian doctors, doctors, volunteer doctors from the movement of doctors in Brazil, engineers, teachers, and some peasant farmers. So they moved to Shibabava, one of the districts was affected. And then with the local population, they tried to rebuild what was lost. So, for example, they organized food sovereignty sites where they were producing food, reorganizing the gardens of the local gardens of the population. They rebuilt some, I guess, 2 schools, and then they also treated disease like immediate disease that people get in terms of crisis, like the diarrhea, fevers, like toothaches and stuff like that. So they stayed for 2 months in that particular district and supporting the local population and so on. That was for me very, 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 very good. And what I actually found out, also in context of solidarity, that UNAC did, is that some farmers that were affected were actually encouraged to move from their area and to stay with other farmers. UNAC is the stands for um, National Small Scale Farmers Union of Mozambique. Is one of the biggest in the region and the first member of La Via Campesina in Southern Africa. So yeah, so what they did, so when the other farmers would come, they would allocate land for them to produce during a specific period until they felt like they could go back to their area. So this is a very strong peasant farmer to farmer type of solidarity and so on. So thank you.
Fortunately, he has an online meeting. We're going to move on to Awande, Grand Eco-Centric Futures. His topic is the Green New Deal is counter-hegemony. Is that Mike working?
The Green New Deal as counter. I just want to start with an introduction, which obviously sets a foundation, or it's to set the context within which the concept of a Green New Deal occurs, and the concept of its counter-hegemonic comes about. I think obviously everyone in this room is somewhat aware of climate change, but just to introduce the context through which the Green New Deal came out of. In 2018, the United Nations panel, the IPCC, had released its reports on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which at worried seen before that this occurs just after the Paris Climate Agreement. So it's happening in that time and space when this issue is beginning to pick up in a way in which I think now has finally reached. And its main finding in that report was that we should stop global warming at 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees. So previous to that, around the time of the Paris Agreement, 2 degrees had been understood as something by world governments and politicians as an acceptable level at which heating should be limited to. So this paper suggested that 2 degrees temperature increase would lead to increased occurrence of extreme weather events, rising sea level, decreased Arctic sea ice, coral bleaching, and the loss of ecosystems, among other adverse effects. But the main thing that comes out of this, and the most important thing to take from it in understanding the Green New Deal and the motivations behind it, and why it could be asked, could it be considered as a counter-hegemonic project, was that the report stated that we had less than 10 years in 2018 to limit heating at 1.5 degrees. We're at 2022 now. And it also required, what it called for, was an expeditious reduction in emissions and rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of human society. Rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. That's very clear. We're not mincing words there with what's required. These are just illustrations that came out at the time, showing the change in heating projected at these different levels of heating, and what the IPCC report was speaking about with regards to the changes that we would see on our planet. The theoretical framework that I used in my paper was the neo-Gramscian approach, just to cover a couple of Gramscian concepts which help understand what I was looking at. The first that you have to contend with to understand is the concept of hegemony, which can be simply put as a combination of coercion and consent, not merely exercised by the state, but also by civil society as well. So basically, the whole framework and structure of what is constituted as what governs our society and the way in which we see, understand the world. The historic bloc is the alliance among various social groupings and who are politically organized around a set of hegemonic ideas, or for the alignment of material forces, institutions, and ideologies to help maintain, stabilize a certain hegemonic order. Or they could be a group that is seeking to improve that hegemonic order. If they succeed, then they help initiate a new hegemonic project. The historic bloc also helps give strategic direction and coherence to all the constituent elements of this historic bloc, or of the group that is dominant and maintains the hegemonic order. And intellectuals are people and groups throughout society who help do the work of the dominant group by speaking, discussing, and promoting the ideas that constitutes or describe or supports this hegemonic order, but it can also be a group which is seeking to introduce a counter-hegemonic order, or a counter-hegemonic group that is trying to help shape and change the thinking of the masses towards a different way of understanding how society can be ordered. Good sense and common sense are also can be understood as a commonly held consensus amongst people within society, the things that they take to be true without questioning, that are filtered down from this hegemonic order. And then obviously the concept of counter-hegemony, and ideal structures that seek to create a new political ideological order. It's just an illustration of how Gramsci speaks with regards to these ideas and the way in which he articulates the concept of ideological superstructure and economic base, interrelation between the material forces and the other cultural and societal factors that help give structure, shape, and maintain ideologies and hegemonic projects. So obviously, in terms of our society today, all these things are interacting and working together to maintain and give structure to what we take as being our world today, our society, our country, and our politics, and how we see it, and how it's also perpetuated or continued. So the New Deal. The New Deal was a set or a series of reforms introduced by Franklin D. Roosevelt as a response to the Great Depression between 1933 and 1939. It was a series of financial reforms, public works projects, programs, and regulations in the United States. It focused primarily on what historians have now come to term as the 3 Rs, which are relief, reform, and recovery, as a way of reviving America's economy and American society after the effects of the Great Depression, or what it was going through at that time. Relief being relief for the unemployed people in society who were suffering from the unemployment crisis caused by the crash. Recovery for the economy, which was greatly impacted by the Depression, obviously, and then reform for the financial system and institutions that was seen as being responsible for allowing or initiating or causing this crisis. Other things that came underneath each of these different parts of this program. In relief, you saw programs which were seeking to deal with food, shelter, medicine, and healthcare, which is what people unemployed were primarily struggling with at the time. Recovery and policies around recovery obviously based mainly around employment, various employment schemes and projects that were put by the government at the time to help generate employment, and obviously policies for regulating banks and other businesses, and then reforms of those institutions during that period. So this period of the initiation of the New Deal and New Deal politics at the time was successful in the way in which Roosevelt's government was able to gather, generate support amongst American society for his reform projects. But what it also did is initiate a new era, a new hegemonic era in terms of what was accepted in mainstream American politics as being necessary and allowed in terms of the economic policies and the political direction in which the government was faced. obviously, this period is then met with the Second World War. The Second World War causes a lot of shifts globally in terms of how governments and economies were structured. But after the war, in the post-war period, and after Roosevelt's death, who died in 1945, the foundation of the New Deal project helped initiate within America a new era, a new post-war era of what some would call embedded liberalism. This was taking place in other countries around the world due to other conditions caused by the war, but primarily in America, the New Deal within American politics, within the Democratic Party, created a new dominant ideology in the way in which politics was being done in America, in the way in which the state and the economy was managed. And this saw this hegemonic project was characterized by principles of embedded liberalism, which was a mix of the Fordist accumulation and Keynesian welfare states, mass production, mass consumption, and the state's function was also seen as being to balance the interests of capital and organized labor. So also strong unions and strong worker representation, which came out of the New Deal. Obviously, that's something which began to wane further and further away from the time of the New Deal. But at the time, it was something which had been ushered in by that era. And then structurally, also, the way this was maintained was business, government, and labor had a political coalition of sorts. So particularly within the Democratic Party and the more prominent or important voting blocks had to take that into consideration if you wanted to rise to power during that period. And then obviously there's also industrial policy, which helped set the standards of the social welfare and where it was set by the states. This was then followed, or in this period in the 20th century, was then followed by the neoliberal hegemonic order, or the neoliberal project, which we are currently living under. This change begins during the economic turmoil of the 1970s, and it was around this time that the groups who would form part of the dominant neoliberal group began to make their moves and began to gain more space within American politics specifically, but also globally. And the theoretical dimensions of this neoliberal ideology was generally initiated by a small group of dedicated academics, thinkers, and historians. One particular person who's really important in the foundation and the framing of the neoliberal ideology and neoliberal ideas that would come after this was Friedrich Hayek, particularly his 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom, which was very foundational in terms of what would come after the ideas with regards to arguments against state intervention, particularly arguing against what was happening in the Keynesian era, and also other philosophical ideas of freedom being achieved through unrestricted market capitalism, and this would fizzle down in other ways. Policy-wise, this was trade barriers had to be removed, reducing government spending for things such as public education and other government programs, removing currency controls, reducing and eliminating labor regulations, and other progressive taxes. During this period, also, what happens is you start to see the merging of the interests of carbon capital as a group and that of the neoliberal order or the neoliberal project, particularly within the American context. During the Second World War, oil becomes increasingly important in American politics, obviously for the war effort, but this continues post-war. And what happens when the energy crisis of the 1970s hits is that carbon capital finds itself in a very great position in the sense that their importance, which at that point had not necessarily been at the top of the table in comparison to other forms of capital, really shoots all the way above everyone else because of the economic ramifications that are being caused by this oil crisis. And they use that as an opportunity to position themselves to gain greater political strength in their position. And it is during this period where the context of climate change, the understanding of what carbon does to our environment and what carbon does to what it's doing to the world, the understanding of the concept of climate change first emerges. And it is during this period, which could have been a foundational moment in terms of how governments and the American government sought to address that issue, that we see the change from President Carter to Reagan and the solidification of the neoliberal order, and also the solidification of carbon capital as being a mainstay within that neoliberal order, particularly within American society and American politics. In the 21st century, you see the continuation of that. It becomes a national security matter under the Bush administration, and then obviously President Barack Obama accelerates the use of hydrocarbons and the use of these other carbon products as a way of gaining American energy dependence. These are some of the political terms and the political justifications for this intensification during that period, which brings us to the Green New Deal. So the Green New Deal is a term which has been spoken of or brought about by different people in the past. Keynesian economist Ann Pettifer, conservative parliamentarian Thomas Friedman, but a number of people have proposed or thought of an idea of conceived of the concept of a Green New Deal. But what is understood as now currently and the origins of its current concept come out of the period towards the end of the Obama administration into the Trump administration. It's closely linked with the generational shift in environmental politics in the United States that happens during that period and the rise of movements such as the Sunrise Movement and young progressive politicians such as Alexander Ocasio-Cortez. But the Green New Deal is not a thing set in stone. It's not an idea that is closed and shut. It still was and is going through a process of articulation and definition. But the main concept and the main core of a Green New Deal is that it's something which lies in the intersection between the core principles of the core pillars of the Green New Deal resolution, which was introduced by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez after she'd come into power, and also which are based on tackling climate change and also the fundamental restructuring of the political economy of the United States. So these main goals or these main pillars are to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions through fair and just transition, create millions of high quality, high wage jobs, invest in infrastructure and the industry of the United States, secure clean air, water, climate, and community resilience, and promote justice and equity by stopping current and preventing future and historic oppression of frontline and vulnerable communities. So these are a number of broad goals. They are quite clear in terms of what they're trying to accomplish, but they are broad nonetheless. And this leaves space for a difference between what can be understood as a true Green New Deal, which is in line with the spirit and principles of those who first introduced it into the mainstream, and then also a co-option of the term, which we saw in the 2020 elections, where various and many Democrats all ran saying that they would support a Green New Deal, such as the current president, vice president. But obviously, those would be used for political gains to win over a certain support base, which then suggested that the Green New Deal was instituting or initiating itself as being a counter-hegemonic project in the sense of creating a new hegemonic ideal of how society should be and can be constructed politically and economically by fundamentally restructuring the political economy of the United States as it was aiming to do. And some of the key ways in which this project which has not been matured, it is not over, it's still in the process of articulation or waning. It still sits, or is still sitting at the space of this differentiation between the principles of economic and social justice, climate justice, or at its most radical anti-capitalist and post-capitalist and decolonial elements versus being something which can be articulated as another manifestation of green capitalism, maintaining the status quo under that edifice, but with the characteristics of deeply extractive needs, obviously, for the technologies which would need to be put in place to initiate it. So, in closing, a counter-hegemonic project, or hegemonic projects as they are instituted in history or as they occur, are things that happen over time and are processes which are continuous and occur on a continuum or spectrum. The idea of the Green New Deal at its initiation into the mainstream was strong and was powerful in its opposition to the current dominant way in which the American society had been ordered, and the current American hegemonic project had been initiated and continued. But it is something which is still in the process of its continued challenge. Whether it be a truly counter-hegemonic project is something which will be yet to see if the various constituent groups and elements that are pushing this counter-hegemonic idea succeed in initiating some of these plans and then shaping society in a way which would constitute a significant break from the hegemonic order of neoliberalism. Thank you.
I have a question for you about radical version of the Greek thing that never really expressed in coming out. I mean, of course, wonderful idea, but the state is crucial in this, and they never take on privatization. So, I mean, is it even possible, given the relations between capital and the regulatory that reinforces its close relationship with the state? It's possible to have a counter-hegemonic project like this, state in the center, and they never really how you're gonna
in that way. But also the particular reason why I focus on the US one specifically is also because in this period of time, I think I would say post 2015, Paris Climate Agreement has initiated a new era in terms of the mainstream understanding of climate change and responses towards it. And the Green New Deal of this period, the US one in particularly I'm speaking prior to the previous elections, has then had a kind of spillover effect. If you look at the European one that you're speaking about also, some of the thinking and inspiration is also taking from that US one, even though they obviously vary in a great number of ways. But there is a kind of spark initiated ideologically from that one into the European one. Also, they don't call it, they weren't calling it a Green New Deal. I think they were calling it a Green Industrial Revolution. But during Corbyn's campaign, was also another kind of British version of it that came from so in particular, interesting American one is very much American focus, as most things which have to do with American politics, and then just derivatives come out of that. But it had something to say in terms of the way in which the global political economy is structured. What were the progressive responses, or seemingly progressive responses, towards restructuring that and moving away from what we've been within for the past 40 years or so, particularly in meeting the current moment. So for me, that was the most interesting thing about it, because what the European one would have to contend with also once it moves beyond the borders of Europe and Europe's geopolitical role with the rest of the world, particularly with the United States, is that also they wouldn't stray too far from what would be allowed from America. Obviously, then there's also the relationship between certain international institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, and how they'd also be seemingly affected if such ideas were able to take root in the United States and in Europe also, and then that would have effects or consequences for the rest of us also. And then with regards to Michelle's question, the contending with the states for me is it cannot really be counter-hegemonic or hegemonic if it has no plan for how to deal with the state, because we live in nation-state systems, and these policies and these programs occur within a state. So if you have no way of conceptualizing or contending with how state power can be taken to enact these goals, then it cannot be counter-hegemonic in any sense, because you're not going for power, and true power, unfortunately, begins at the level of the state, at a national level, and then we go obviously internationally. But the thing is, I was also focused primarily at the start of the Sanders campaign, because it was in a period when there was that window of opportunity in which this was being introduced in a way where there was an opportunity for state power to be taken through presidential campaign, but then there were also a wave of other campaigns that were happening at the time. But none of them, and you're correct in this way, had fully spelt out or dealt with the corporatization of the state that had happened throughout the 20th century, and how to disembed those two. I think the Sanders campaign was probably the one which was the best in articulating that connection and how interlinked those relationships were. But its methods of disembedding it weren't fully articulated and weren't realized in terms of how his campaign had described their version of a Green New Deal. And then obviously after him, there's people like Elizabeth Warren who also had ones. But the further away from Sanders you go, the less and less they become in terms of how they can describe that relationship and the ways in which they produce a means of this embedding that relationship so that a Green New Deal can achieve what it really wants to achieve without being encumbered by capital in the United States and internationally, obviously. And then obviously since the end of that campaign, you can see how the discourse of the Green New Deal in the mainstream has kind of waned also, because it has no avenue towards articulating new routes towards gaining power and reshaping the state. And I think that's what has led it to be a lot more quiet now in terms of mainstream US politics, and I think internationally in terms of how we understand American politics also at this current point. Which brings me then to the South African point. And I think my response for that is very straight, that the Green New Deal does not have to be taken one for one, but rather it provides us a way of thinking with regards to the scale of what needs to be done to address the climate crisis and how that should be approached in terms of scale and scope, politically and socially. And for me, that's the Climate Justice Charter. And I think that if you haven't read the charter, if you're aware of the charter, if you know about the charter, if you're not aware of the charter, then you should read the charter, because I think the charter provides a South African orientation towards this issue, towards this problem. It provides the framework and it provides the foundation for what can be built. And that's the same thing about these projects. And I think this is the most important thing I can say about it also, and why I'm also going to, why I'm saying this about the charter, is that these things begin as ideas, and they begin as frameworks and structures first. And then what's built from it is then what we come to understand as the project, or the hegemonic project, or as what we take as the common sense idea of what is done economically and organize our society. So that's why I would say the charter is I can say for me, biases aside, that was was McCalled again, fits the scale and scope of what needs to be done socially and politically in line with the climate crisis for our society, South African.
Thank you, Awande. That was excellent. We got to give Olanrewaju a chance to give his presentation even over lunch. We'll have some short Q&A after his. Olanrewaju, over to you. You have 15 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Olanrewaju Ojo Emupenne, and the title of my research is The Geopolitics of Climate Change and Violent Conflicts in Africa, the Nigerian and Kenyan perspectives. This is, the research is still ongoing, so I will not be able to provide the detail of the work. So it's going to be a skeletal work because I just concluded my field work, and I'm in the process of doing my transcription and data entry. But be that as it may, Prof, I want to appreciate you for this privilege. I'm one of part of the EFS cohorts for this year 2022, and the fund provided was of tremendous help for my fieldwork in Kenya and also in part of Nigeria. There is an apparent consensus among scholars that climate change remains one of the major issues that confront humanity in the 21st century. You can see some of fellow scholar Ahmed, even United Nations, Oshoff and Guabo. And we see that the effect of climate change in Nigeria and Kenya is severe due to high dependence on agriculture, land, and natural resources. We can see some of the effects. This the sea level rise problem is in the community in the southern part of Nigeria. We see increased precipitation, extreme weather conditions, and also risk to the nature. We also see that climate change is a threat to livelihood, severe floodings, and also droughts. And some of other effects is climate-induced mortality, as we all know, economic losses and adverse impacts on adverse impacts. But the major focus among us, all these effects, impacts of climate change, the focus of this thesis is on violent conflict, how climate change can instigate or can lead to violent conflict. And yeah, sorry for the mix-up. Now, the value of the study considers the role of climate change in violent conflicts between pastoralists and herders in the Tana River County in Kenya and the Middle Belt region in Nigeria. And you can see that a lot of work, much has been written on the role of climate change in instigating or causing a violent conflict. But there are little empirical studies which has really confirmed whether this is a fact or just a fallacy. So this study is intent to actually confirm whether climate change can actually lead to violent conflicts or not. So we have the picture one you see there used to be this a pastoralist and the herds. And you see that there is nothing like carrying of a rifle or any assorted weapons. Traditionally, this used to be how the pastoralist has been moving. But currently, we've been seeing some of the pastoralists carrying weapons, moving about and killing, maiming, and all the rest, engaging in violent conflict with the farmers. So this, what we want to what we intend to find out, what has led the nomadic pastoralists that have been very peaceful, very accommodating, going about their normal business before, but now we see them carrying assault weapons like AK-47. That is what we intend to find out in this very particular study. The study is systematically guided by 4 research questions. We have 1 core question and 3 sub-questions. And this is the study location in Nigeria. I covered Abuja, which is the Federal Capital Territory, and Benue and Plateau State in the Middle Belt, and Kaduna, Sokoto State in the core north of the country. Kaduna and Sokoto State is where you have a lot of headers, pastoralists. While Benue and Plateau State is where you have a lot of farmers. Because of droughts and lack of arable land for grazing, most of the headers in the core north of Kaduna and Sokoto State, they do migrate down to Benue and Plateau State, where we have a lot of arable land. But because of their migration, they do move into the farmland, destroying farm and even some of their cattle feeding on the farm. And also have similar problem in Kenya. In Kenya, I'm covering Nairobi because that is the seat of power, and we have a lot of policy makers in Nairobi. Then Tana River County, and in this Tana River County, we have 2 communities, Oma communities and Pokomo communities. Oma people are majorly herders, like we have in Nigeria, while Pokomo people are majorly agrarian farmers. The same problem that transpires in Nigeria between the pastoralists and the farmers, crop farmers. We also have similar problem in Kenya as well, between the Oma people and the Pokomo people. So administration of questionnaires and the interview session, like I told you, I've concluded the data collection exercise. I've traveled in Nigeria, parts of Nigeria, and also traveled to Kenya for data collection exercise. We had some areas in Nigeria, the challenges that confronted this, the field work that we encountered during the field work in Nigeria because of the increase in this Boko Haram insurgency and the widespread of this banditry, kidnapping issues in the country, makes some areas really difficult to assess. So I have to make use of some indigenous, Fulani, Hausa people that are very familiar with the terrain to help with the data collection in those areas. Whereas I covered the Federal Capital Territory, and also in Kenya, we had problem because I went to Kenya before this presidential election in the country, and we have serious constraint because people were not willing to grant an interview because they were thinking that maybe whatever they say could be used against them during the election period. But now they've conducted the election, but the data collection is over. Let me skip this and move to the next page. This is the current state of research work. I stated that the field work has been concluded, and the amount of data collected is a bit voluminous because I covered 2 countries. Currently, I'm in the process of coding data entering using SPSS, and about 95% of the KI's qualitative data collected have been transcribed. I just have about 5% left. Once the data entry has been concluded and also the transcription, I just move to the next stage of data analysis. So I hope that we have opportunity when this research has been concluded in the next few months, that we will have opportunity. Maybe this type of program will still be organized next year, and we have opportunity to present my findings and also recommendation to this great house. But meanwhile, these are the preliminary findings in the course of going through the questionnaires, completed questionnaires, and also during the transcription of the interview, that there is low level awareness about climate change among farmers and herders in Africa, in these two countries that are covered. Although they know that there are some changes in the environment, but they don't actually know what is climate change. So in this regard, I think that a lot still needs to be done to create this awareness, so that we also let them know what are the causes of climate change and how to prevent climate change. It will really, really help. Another finding is that indeed climate change leads to migration and rivalry, as that is a part of our preliminary findings. And also there is a causal relationship between climate change and violent conflicts. I also find out that the result of violent conflict by farmers and herders is due to lack of confidence in the legal system in Kenya and Nigeria. That the legal system is too slow, and some of all these participants in this crisis, they just want immediate justice and not the rest. So they resort to violent conflict instead of seeking justice in the court of law. This is just the brief presentation. I appreciate every one of you. Thank you.
Thank you for that brilliant presentation. Just some quick questions. The first one, you said the local communities don't know about climate change. Is it that they don't know the kind of scientific language that you're using, or they don't know about climate change? Because certainly they are suffering the impacts, and it is the impacts that are leading to these farmer-herder skirmishes. Secondly, is there any reason why you left out Adamawa, or is it just the size of your sample group? Finally, are you also looking at differentiated impacts, specifically impacts on women and children, and also people living with disabilities, because that is also a significant problem, specifically on the Nigerian side of the research, where we still have lots of customary led systems. And finally, if you will, you mentioned solutions. Are they using local customary type systems to solve some of the problems, rather than only seeking justice in modern government courts? Thanks.
I just wanted to ask, and it's probably a bit thorny, the question. The state's response so far to the climate justice movement has been, overview of it is it's passive-aggressive. So how would you see the climate justice charter movement activating this impasse?
Okay. This whole system. Okay, Olanrewaju, are you there?
Yes.
Just tell
yes,
us about
Prof.
the bigger architecture to kind of overcome conflict in Africa. I mean, how do you see us kind of developing a sort of approach that ensures our conflict doesn't plunge into deeper violence? What are your thoughts on that? Answer. Who wants to answer? Awande, go first. Okay, Awande wants to ask a question. Go ahead. Do you have the mic?
Just wanted to ask a little more with regards to the role of, just to jump also regional bodies such as ECOWAS and the East African Community, particularly those two, seeing that you chose Nigeria and Kenya because I think they are the most advanced regional bodies on the continent.
I notice in Latin America they've got a more neutral term, eco-social. So you don't commit yourself to the socialist part, but a bit more broader, right? And even yesterday, the speaker, Nora Rothsels, also talked of eco-social, because I asked us, why do they want us in the South to talk about degrowth when you don't really mean degrowth, but you mean aggregate degrowth, perhaps, where the overdeveloped North stops growing and you leave space for the South to grow, but also what kind of growth is very important. But even that's been criticized, about whether the North should degrow or whether you're talking about aggregate degrowth, even in that context, where certain sectors like care work, a whole lot of things should grow. And ecologically destructive sectors should not grow. That's how that's couched. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, because I'm making an issue of this. I'm saying to the degrowth movement people, and I've read this latest book. It's got a whole anti-capitalist, decolonial perspective. They're trying to be as radical as possible. Great. So the content is fine, but they're insisting on this degrowth label. And I'm saying that has no resonance in the South. We're not going to get anyone to engage with us if we come up with degrowth, unless I'm mistaken. But they're saying that's a provocation. So I don't know, any thoughts on this?
Great intervention. Okay, we got to wrap up now. So let's take some inputs from our panelists. Awande, you can go first, and then Olanrewaju, and then I'm going to wrap up this whole colloquium.
Yeah. So I would just begin with Janet's and then segue into the second question, because I think for me they're actually both linked. And just to begin with, I think what you're seeing or what you've seen from the South African state is not uncharacteristic of the way in which it deals with grievances from the populace or from people who live in the country with regards to what we want them to do, what we want to see them doing. So I just want to differentiate that between what we expect them to do, which is like the bare minimum, and you see that with service delivery protests and things like that, where there is an expectation for the state to intervene on our behalf, and you've seen what that leads to when people don't feel heard. And then there's also what we want them to do, where we have aspirations for them to go beyond just the bare minimum, to think big, and to also, just to actually apply themselves to the issues that we're facing. And it's not uncharacteristic of our government to be silent or even a bit aggressive in terms of like their response, passive aggressive or aggressive in their responses to what we want them to do. And I think for me, the response that is required from climate justice activists or climate justice forces is to be political. I think I'm a bit young, so I think people with more experience in this can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think another problem with the environmental movement more broadly in the past was, and scientists have alluded to this, and you can see that they're trying to break away from this, was the kind of apolitical nature in which they spoke about these matters of, no, it's a fact. Just accept it as a fact. We're not being political. We're just stating facts. But it is a political issue. Everything's political. And I think that the point is to be political. There are certain political demands that you want to be put in place to create the socio-ecological society, which then brings me to Devon's point and how the two come together for me, is that there's obviously a set of demands which globally are being put forward, which are aligned and are describing, as you said, the same kind of socio-ecological paradigm that people want to be initiated to help us not only avoid the cliff edge of where climate crisis is taking us, but to also do what we know is possible to create a more just and fair society. And I agree with you. I do take issue also with the whole degrowth thing and about the marketing, because I think when you come down to it and these kind of conversations or ideas, it is about marketing. It is about how you introduce these ideas to people. I think it's a bit patronizing to be like, just accept it, accept this terminology. The whole point is that you want to show people and teach people and bring them over to say, hey, look, this is in your benefit. So you can't just whack them over the head with a term that you know from the offset they are going to reject. Even if you want to provoke, it must be a provocation in the sense of bringing people together. It must be a provocation which helps unite, consolidate, and grow this perspective of a new socio-ecological society. And I know in the global south, degrowth is just, it's never going to take off. And if it's not about the concept of degrowth, then we can find a better term for it. And it's our responsibility, I'd say, as people who are engaging with these ideas to then make those bridges, to then help people pull them away to say, no, don't just reject it just because of what it says. But it means X, Y, and Z. And I think that the two for me, hence why I'm saying I think the questions come together, is that it's the greatest political issue of our time. Because I think it's particularly in the global south, when I'd say something like that, people would say, no, we're facing unemployment, we're facing a stagnant economy, we're facing all these other issues. But the climate crisis supersedes all of that because those things don't just disappear, they only become worse. So hence, if you really care about all of those things, then you should care about wanting a socio-ecological order or a social ecological transformation. And that's why, for me, the only response is to become political, be politically organized, see it for the political issue and the political moment that it is.
Excellent. Olanre, can you come in to respond? And then I'm wrapping up.
Yeah, yes, Prof. Thank you very much for the questions. The first one about the awareness about climate change. Of a truth, the farmers and the herders are not aware about the scientific terms. Climate change. They know that there are changes in the environment, but they did not even know the cause and the effects of this climate change. That is why it's very, very important for us to create, to engage in more awareness program. Secondly, you mentioned Adamawa. As at the time I was submitting the research proposal, the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast, because Adamawa is in the northeast of Nigeria, the level of Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast of the country was very, very high. And I do not want to risk my life, so I have to pick two states from the northwest, which was a bit relatively peaceful around that period that I was submitting the proposal. And I selected the Sokoto and the Kaduna state. That's why Adamawa is left out. On the issue of women, children, and people living with disability, the research could not cover all that. But in the course of working on this research, I realized that there is need for me to also work on the issue of the impact of climate change on women and youths. I've already listed it, that I'm going to work on it. It's going to be part of my recommendation for further research. And I'm also going to write a research paper on that very particular issue. I've noted it earlier. The fourth question there concerning the local customary court, we see that we have a local customary court, and some of the, like in the case of Bauchi State, they are working, the farmers and herders are working hand in hand to resolve this issue. But the focus of the states, the two states in the Middle Belt region, Plateau State and Benue State, the issue is still very, very critical. People are not looking at that very particular angle of customary. The only thing the state government of Benue State has done is to introduce an anti-open grazing law, forbidding farmers, herders from grazing their cattle in the open field. And Prof, you mentioned the issue of how conflict can be prevented in Africa. There are five. I think there are. We can focus on 5 areas, and number one is the states. I mean the national governments and and the bodies, regional bodies like African Union and ECOWAS and EAC can focus on preventive strategies or proactive measures against climate change. They can also embark on a sensitization, reorientation, and a dissuasion program of the potential combatants. They could also identify and deal with the sponsors of violent conflicts in this in Africa, and lastly, they should, or second to the next one is blocking illicit cash flow by this sponsor of a violent conflict in Africa. I will also see that they could also engage in the radicalization program, like is being done in this part of the present government in Nigeria is trying to embark upon. And someone mentioned the ECOWAS and the East African Community. Actually, I administer questionnaires at the ECOWAS headquarters in Abuja, and also interviewed a good number of their staff. But what they told me specifically was that the issue of implementing policies, ECOWAS can only take decision on how to prevent conflicts or how to ensure climate justice. But the issue of implementing those policies actually rests with the national government. That ECOWAS does not usually go to the local government or provincial government to implement policies. So the Nigerian government and the Kenyan government, they have a lot to do in terms of preventing this violent conflict between farmers and herders. I could only cover ECOWAS, but I could not travel to Dar es Salaam to interview or administer questionnaires because that's where we have the headquarters of East African Community in Tanzania. Because of fund I got to Kenya. I administered the questionnaires and conduct the interview in Kenya, and I returned. So I couldn't travel to Dar es Salaam to go to conduct interview and administer questionnaire at EAC headquarters. So I think that's where, Prof, I hope I have reacted to all the questions.
Remarks just to respond to this debate about degrowth. I mean, I think that the real underlying issue is deaccumulation, and this is where we've got to start thinking about different strategies. So our coal industry will end in this country, and it has to end. It has to be deaccumulated. You're going to have other industries as well that may not be able to make this transition. I mean, with all the green talk coming from the cement industry, for example, cement is a highly carbon intensive industry. Okay? We're going to have to deaccumulate it, and we're going to have to really think about alternatives that are much more ecological and so on. The consumption side of deaccumulation is very, very important. We've been having these debates with Awande about the Climate Justice Charter and this call for zero waste and simple living. And this speaks to the bigger issue that Roland raised as well, which is a philosophical shift in society. It's the ontologies. How do we understand our relationship with nature? Okay, and how do we work towards a non-destructive relationship with nature? What is that? And to get society to grapple with that question, and that relates directly to mass consumption, how we live, our ways of being, and so on, in very profound ways. And that does require a political project, which is what Awande has been arguing for. I mean, if you take what he's saying about being political about the climate crisis, he's saying go beyond just the symbolic stuff and so on. We got to operate at the level of a political project that can change the country, okay, in very, very profound structural, systemic, socio-ecological terms. So that's the big challenge. I mean, imagine having a platform in this country that opens up those debates around how do we see the macroeconomy, how do we see deaccumulation, and so on. That's going to be very interesting to see how that lands in society, how that shapes discourse, and so on. You know, it's going to be very controversial because growth has hegemony in our society. I mean, our media every day reinforces growth, 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 growth. But the time has come. The time has come to unsettle these orthodoxies, these modes of thinking, and so on. We've got to do it. We have no choice, actually. Olawande is our last PhD student that we'll be funding as EFS. You know, we've been in existence for 4 years. We've got a no-cost extension till 2025. So we felt as the core group that it was very, very important to really have this moment of pause, to kind of bring together sort of intellectual production that students have been engaged with, and to create this platform to reflect on it in a more systematic way. Now, if we had to produce a book, if you like, Emancipatory Future Studies. What on earth is that? Okay. If we were to produce a book on this as a field of study, I think that it will be a very, very compelling intellectual output, if you like, based on what you shared with us over the past day and a half. But we're not going to do that because you all have to finish your projects. You have to finish your PhDs and you have to finish your masters, etc. But if we think more systematically, so, you know, the Anthropocene, I started talking about that at the beginning of this colloquium. It's a geological marker. It marks out his, you know, sort of grand scale, Earth history scale time. But it's also about ecological critique. And it's also about spotlighting the ecological crises that we are living through. And in many ways, the research that was shared over the past day and a half speaks to different dimensions of the crises that we are living through. Whether it's water crises, whether it's food crises, whether it's the climate crises, and so on. I think the other important point is that, you know, I kind of posed the question, you know, what is emancipation? What is emancipatory? Emancipation from what forms of oppression? And I think that the colloquium has started clarifying that question. And clearly, this is also where kind of capitalism fits into the Anthropocene. And, you know, it's oppression from carbon capitalism. It's oppression from failing states. That we want to emancipate ourselves from. It's emancipation from the domination of particular kinds of corporations, of ruling classes, elites, etc. And that's coming through in different ways in the research that was shared. But it's also emancipation to construct something, alternative imaginaries. And a lot of your research has focused on some of those practices. I mean, whether it's commons thinking, whether it's solidarity economy, whether it's the universal basic income, whether it's climate justice, reparations, you name it. I mean, there's a whole set of practices here that encapsulate, that articulate and express emancipatory futures as living alternatives. So yes, emancipation from something, but emancipation for something is definitely part of our research inquiries. Now, future studies. I think if you think with all the research that you all shared, future studies is clearly kind of focusing on how is the subaltern trying to kind of navigate? What is the map of subaltern emancipation? And in different ways, your research foci are helping us kind of work out this map. Different topics you all are working on, you know, everything from Olanre's work on conflict in parts of Africa, our continent, to work around waste recyclers and waste pickers, to work around trade unions and investment companies, which most of you missed yesterday. All of this is really important research foci. And it actually delineates the scope and the remit of what we can bring into emancipatory future studies. In other words, we have a rich research agenda. I think that's what I'm saying. And your topics and your research projects kind of underline that. I think the point about theory is very crucial. And many of you are using critical theoretical approaches. Try and bring the subaltern into view as a unit of analysis, as a focus in your research. So, you know, the theoretical underpinnings of this range from what we heard yesterday, which is kind of ecological perspectives, you know, eco-feminist perspectives, ecological Marxist perspectives, and even neo-Gramscian perspectives. I mean, we can go on, but what's exciting about this is that critical theory is at work here to really kind of work out how do we do research, to kind of bring these complex realities into some level of ordering, and to kind of bring focus to the subaltern as a research object, if you like. So there's some exciting theoretical underpinnings, and it's rich. In terms of methods that many of you are using, again, I mean, I think it's very impressive. I mean, we have everything from art as method to understand emancipatory futures, to documentary making as method. We have case studies as method. We have quantitative approaches as method. We have ethnography as method. So there's a very rich methodological basis if we develop a field of study, and it's displayed in your work. It's coming out in your work. So to conclude then around this particular theme, I think that we really have the potential here for an intellectual project that can hopefully, well, grow beyond where we are now. But this is my dilemma, and I'm glad Mucha is in the room as well, is, you know, the climate crisis is going to continue. This project has to end by 2025. But how do we have a conversation now in WITS about research that's very important in terms of the climate crisis? There's strong epistemological, methodological sort of research sort of depth in this. Where do we take this project? And I think this is a question we don't have to answer now, but it's a question we have to grapple with over the next 3 years before we wrap this project up. Related to this is the curation of our intellectual practice. And hence, I want to appeal to all of you, if you haven't sent us your short papers yet, or if your work is still sort of ongoing and you're midstream in your research, it's fine. But we are going to be putting all the kind of summary papers on your research on the blog, on the Emancipatory Future Studies webpage, and on the blog. But in addition, I think what's important about the webpage is that we want you, as you finish your projects, and many of you have, is to update your profiles. Please send us the link to your master's report or your PhD, etc., so that this becomes available to a larger public, if you like. We really need to make sure this knowledge is diffused, it gets out there, and people can draw on this for trying to understand what we're living at the moment. This is the purpose of this project. And there's an ethics to this as well. This is subaltern studies in a sense. And so you also want this research to be available to everyone in society. The other point I want to make is about another functionality we have on our webpage, which is mapping the alternative world. So yes, while we're living through these catastrophic crises, which are going to intensify, we are also trying to kind of work out what are the alternatives out there. So in your research, if you have found projects, campaigns, initiatives, think tanks, intellectuals that are doing work on the next planet, the next society, the next civilization, and emancipatory work, please alert myself and Eurisha with details so that we can start logging this on the map. We actually literally have a map of the planet, and we have different movements, different parts of this planet. So we need to demonstrate that another world is happening. Another world making is happening. So, please help us. So waste recyclers or whoever else, send us that information. We'll put it on there. Going forward, we'll have 3 conferences till 2025. Next year, we'll be having a conference on eco-socialism. And that conference will be held in partnership with the Marx Dictionary in Berlin. They approached me, and they want to partner on this conference. So this will be an EFS, jointly hosted EFS Marx Dictionary conference. And so we'll have about 12 sort of think pieces on eco-socialism. And from there, if people want to take their work further, they will then develop it with the board of the Marx Dictionary into an entry into the Marx Dictionary. The Marx Dictionary is a project that started in the 1980s, largely centered in the West and so on, but it's evolving. So that's going to be our big conference. The date is already set, October 16th and 17th for next year, and I'm working with them to finalize the program. The third conference we'll have in 2024 is about the commons and commoning the future in Africa. And again, those of you who are working on the commons in our project and others outside our project, we'll be inviting you, and particularly activist scholars, activists on the continent, to come and help us clarify how is the commons and commoning featuring in response to the worsening climate crisis. The third conference that we'll have in 2025, which will be the last conference of the EFS project, will be on different forms of subaltern knowledge and emancipatory futures. Here we'll be looking at tacit knowledge, which is very embodied, local knowledge, people's knowledge, people science, and things like that. So all the knowledge that we need to survive the climate crisis that is implicated in subaltern praxis, if you like. So those are the kind of 3 big conferences that will happen. Eco-socialism, commons and commoning, sort of emancipatory futures for Africa, subaltern knowledge for emancipatory futures. In terms of book production, so the EFS project has partnered with the Climate Justice Charter Movement and Daily Maverick, and we've had a series running in Burning Planet around people's futures based on the Climate Justice Charter. That intellectual sort of project will be closing up at the end of September, and we'll be publishing all of those interventions into a book called People's Climate Justice Charter Futures for South Africa. And that will come out next year. So again, it's a curation of all of that work that was done with Daily Maverick and so on. And we launched that publicly as part of raising awareness, etc. The other important book projects would be around transformative politics and emancipatory utopia, and that Michelle and I are working on that book. And it's based on work we've been doing over 10 years, researching various kinds of movements in the world, whether it's factories run by workers in Argentina, whether it's the worker cooperative movement in the Basque Country, whether it's cooperatives in the United States, in local areas, the Bay Area, etc., etc. So that's a very important project for us, and we're hoping to have that book ready by next year, well, early next year, but the draft finished by the end of the year. And then, of course, I'm doing some work on climate famines. So that's another book project that will come before 2025. Alongside this stream, there are 3 more books that are planned in the Democratic Marxism series that I edit. I have an agreement with Wits Press. We've produced 6 volumes. The 7th volume, which is coming out next year, is called Emancipatory Feminism, the Times of COVID-19, Rethinking Social Reproduction. And we have an amazing set of contributors from activists and activist scholars that have worked on sort of different sort of grassroots feminisms, whether it's indigenous feminisms, whether it is eco-feminisms, Marxist feminisms, and so on. That volume is co-edited with Ruth Intlakotse, whom many of the trade unionists know. She's the president of SAFTU. But that is also a contribution to thinking about feminism from an emancipatory futures perspective. Thereafter, we have volume 8, which is going to be about digital capitalism and the fourth industrial revolution, a critique of technotopia. That volume will be put together in a workshop in March, April next year. And some of you, I'm going to reach out to you to be part of that, definitely. Your work deals with technology. I had a conversation with Vincent already, where he was presenting about digital platforms and waste pickers. I think that's very, very important. If our dear colleague Ruth gets her work done, her master's done on robotics and workplaces, that will also be a chapter in that volume, etc. But there'll be other interesting contributions in that book, really disrupting the kind of crude assumptions that people work with about technology. Technology is progress, technology is development, and so on and so on. It's not anti-technology, but it's going to be critical about technology, which is a key thrust in emancipatory futures. The volume after that is going to be about rethinking the state in the context of the climate crisis. Many of you are working on the state, and so I'll also reach out to you to contribute to that volume. It'll be co-edited with Michelle. We really got to rethink the state. Concepts, the ideas we have of the state within the social sciences, even economics, is irrelevant to the world we are going into. We really need to go beyond the developmental state. We need to go beyond the competition state, whatever other designation is given to it. We need to reimagine the state, its competencies, its functions, its roles, how it kind of strengthens democracy. But we also need to think in transitional terms, also beyond the state. And that's what this project is going to be about. My personal position is that we need to start thinking in planetary terms. We need to start thinking in terms of planetary democracy and so on. So some of those chapters will kind of grapple issues. And then the last volume in the series will be decolonizing South Africa and the world. So again, that will come later in the next 5-6 years. But the point is this, is that the work we're doing here will also find a place in the democratic Marxism stream. In terms of sort of this space and its role in WITS, I want to use this opportunity to ask your permission to engage the university around a few things. As we discussed here, you know, this issue of ontologies, humans in nature. You know, we need to leave behind the old humanism. I said this at the beginning of this colloquium. So maybe we need to ask WITS to really talk about the eco-humanities now as a kind of sort of flagship idea. We got to break with anthropocentric thinking. You know, we cannot be teaching sociology and political science and international relations and so on without an understanding of natural relations at the heart of it. This is that ontological shift we need in society. If we are going to be equipping people with jaded, outdated ideas in the university, we're not going to have shifts on degrowth and so on. So eco-humanities is one idea. The other idea I'm going to, well, I'd like your permission on, is to press the university more on the petition we gave them in 2016 for a zero waste, zero hunger, zero carbon university, including considering adopting the climate justice charter and supporting divestment. I mean, the big issue here is, you know, all of you are intellectuals and you're doing research, and you know, we all are speaking to publics, and we cannot speak to publics if our own university is stuck, if our own university is not leading the just transition. This is a very, very important issue. So So I'd like to get your feedback on that just now when I open it up. And finally, a big thank you to Eurisha and Jane, and of course for the admin and for organizing all of us and getting this together. And thank you to all of you who have risen to the challenge of emancipatory future studies. All your projects are amazing. All your projects will be crucial interventions to raise consciousness, to shift discourse in our society. So please finish your work. It's very, very important. Big thank you to the core research group, Mucha and Michelle, their support and contributions to our project. Big thank you to Melon, who has funded this project. And of course, a big thank you to Wits University. So before I conclude, any final reflections from anyone on these remarks? Way forward. Yes, Mucha. No.
Is online. So just to repeat what I said at the beginning is to simply say thanks to everyone who is here, everyone who has contributed, everyone who has listened, participated, asked questions and critical questions that leave many of us, you know, wanting to find out more answers to those questions. And the papers, the few that I managed to listen to, are indeed very rich papers, and I'm expecting that these will certainly find themselves into some, you know, various, you know, avenues. You speak of publics, and there are indeed so many publics and audiences that need to be addressed, and we must always be mindful of those in the manner we write, the language we use, we pitch that language because we want our research to be understood by those we are addressing. The state also needs to hear about what we say in a language that is very clear and direct of our intentions, you know, to try and educate it about the things that are horribly going wrong in society today. I know, Vish, you didn't want us to give an answer to a proposal you made, but I just wanted to say that if you had asked me about the question, you know, around where we go from here, given that this you know, project will be coming to an end, I would not have given you an answer. But you know, for some fortuitous reason, I didn't. I mean, as you know, it so happens that we now have a whole portfolio up in the Vice Chancellor's office, and the one being run by the Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Imran Valodia, which is on sustainability, poverty, and inequality studies. I forget the actual lineup of the terms. But just to say that I do think that continuing conversations with Professor Valodia are going to be very critical, because already we can see the foundation that this project, Emancipatory Futures, is laid down. I mean, who better to begin to address the kinds of issues that concern us, as not just as a university, but as society? Who better to begin to address this than our very own students? We're not going out there seeking for ideas. Our students are doing them and showcasing them in the prize, you know, at the degree and, you know, in depth of thought that's going into these projects. I think it would be quite a huge mistake if we let this project die simply because Melon has decided to turn to other shores. So I'm simply saying, you have my ear for as long as I remain as head of school. Come, let's talk. Let's see how we can ensure that this project does not die simply because money is fizzled out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mucha. And definitely, I think what I will do is coordinate a meeting probably with Imran Valodia. core research group. We have a lunch and we talk about outcomes. Michelle,
Students, researchers, especially Vish, pulling these kind of things off and keeping a vibrant project is hard in the best of times. It's virtually impossible. And I think the last 2 days have actually shown you guys have done everyone. But I also wanted to say, you know, for my trade unionists here and to everyone else, you know, when we started, you know, Vish and I and Devin, and Mucho, we've been obsessed about the environment and the problems for many years. And we used to bang our heads up against the door where people would be like, oh, it's one of many problems. And we kept saying, no, it's the problem. And it used to be, even when I would teach, you know, the social theory course years ago, we had to spend so much time convincing you there was a problem. And I just want to say we've made huge progress that now we agree there's a problem. Now we're trying to figure out what are the answers. So we're in new terrain, and I think we're in an exciting moment because we're no longer denying the problem. We're trying to figure out how to get to a better future. So I'm extremely hopeful that this kind of stuff, these thinking and having you guys in a room like this, no longer questioning that there's a problem, but for the mine workers saying, how do we not destroy lives, but yet find a new future? Right? These are the questions we face, and I think that this kind of coming together is really wonderful. So I just want to also say I think that we've progressed. It doesn't feel like huge progression, but we have. And again, thanks to spaces like EFS, and I agree, Mucha. This thing should, as far as what I've seen, it's one of the most vibrant spaces that we've had and most successful. So I hope we can continue. And I think the fact that the university has a dedicated space now for this is going to show how much more of this kind of work we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And yes, round of applause to everybody. And let's enjoy our lunch and travel safe, everybody.